From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host, back from vacation, David Feldman. How are you doing, David, from your vacation?
Very good. I missed you guys, but Maine is beautiful. Maine is gorgeous.
And also on the show is the man who never takes a vacation. He's here every week, even though Dave and I check out every once in a while, is the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
We have a great show for you today, one that I can personally relate to, and I'm sure many of you can too, because I take blood pressure medication, valsartan, and got a notice about 6 weeks ago that the FDA was recalling the brand that I take because it has a known carcinogen in it. And it directly relates to our first guest today, who has written a book called China RX about the drugs we get from China. So we're going to be talking to healthcare expert Rosemary Gibson, who has an incredibly impressive resume working on behalf of the public interest in all areas of healthcare. In fact, she has received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine. She has written a new book, which I mentioned, entitled China RX, exposing the risks for American dependence on China for medicine. And that will be in the first half of our show. You don't want to miss that. In the second half of the show, we welcome back Ken Reed, Policy Director of League of Fans, which is one of the many organizations initiated by Ralph, this one to advocate, as the name suggests, on behalf of fans. And Ken has a new book out entitled The Sports Reformers, which is a collection of short interviews with all sorts of people connected to sports, current and former athletes, doctors, lawyers, politicians, fans, parents, and many others. And these are all people working to accentuate the positive in the world of sports. In between, we will rush over to the National Press Building and stick a microphone in front of our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, to find out what the bad guys are up to. But first, let's find out what China is putting into our drugs. David?
Rosemary Gibson is an award-winning author, inspirational speaker, and advisor to organizations that advance the public's interest in healthcare. Ms. Gibson serves as senior advisor at the Hastings Center, which is the world's first bioethics research institute, and she's an editor for the Journal of the American Medical Association, a national authority on healthcare reform, Medicare, patient safety, and overtreatment in medicine. Rosemary Gibson has authored many critically acclaimed books, including the one we're going to talk about today. It's entitled China RX, Exposing the Risks for America's Dependence on China for Medicine. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Rosemary Gibson.
David, thank you for having me.
Welcome, Rosemary. Our listeners should be notified. This is going to alarm them. If they take any medicines, right down to aspirin or Tylenol. And this also is an example of runaway corporate globalization, greed, maximizing profits, and everything that can go wrong when there's no adequate regulation and disclosure to the consumers. So this book, China RX, is going to alarm you, listener. But I want to tell you that before we conclude our interview with Rosemary Gibson, we'll talk about an appendix in her book, which is how to find out where your medicines are made. Because right now, more and more of the medicines in our country are imported from China and India. And if they don't import the complete drug, they're importing what are called essential ingredients. Now, on the flap of this very readable book, China RX, the description is, quote, several decades ago, penicillin, vitamin C, and many other prescription and over-the-counter products were manufactured in the United States. But with the rise of globalization, drugs such as antibiotics, anticoagulants, antidepressants, birth control pills, blood pressure medications, cancer drugs, and many others are made in China and sold in the United States. China's biggest impact on the U.S. drug supply is making essential ingredients. Those are the therapeutic ingredients in drugs for thousands of medicines found in American homes and used in hospital intensive care units and operating rooms. And you argue quite convincingly, Rosemary, that there's a national security problem here. I mean, our country doesn't produce penicillin anymore, for example. And second, to put it mildly, the inspection level by the FDA of these laboratories in China are either non-existent, confused, or very rare. And as a result, we have a clear and present danger to the American people. So my first question to you is, why isn't the federal government, whether Republican or Democrat, this is hardly an ideological issue, speaking out against this and doing anything? A lot of your examples are over 10 years ago, there were congressional hearings. It seems to have slowed down. What's the situation?
Ralph, there's two reasons why this isn't being talked about in Washington. Even the valsartan blood pressure medicine that was recalled, we don't hear a peep about this from anyone in Washington. One is the pharma industry has been successful in muzzling the truth about the shift in where our drugs are coming from and the consequences. And it's also true that the Chinese government likes to censor bad information about what's going on that affects Americans. So we're dealing with two very powerful forces that make it challenging to begin to talk about this issue.
Well, what struck me about your book is how many former officials in the drug industry and the FDA sounded the alarm after they retired. So you're not just speaking from the point of view of a few commentaries. You're speaking with a sense of dread as to when the next shoe will drop. And scores of Americans died, many of them right on the operating table about 10 years ago, because they were given a blood thinner called heparin that had a contaminated ingredient in it from China. And there was litigation, and we're going to get to one case pretty soon about what happened. It was on 60 Minutes. It had some publicity, but you would think that this would have led to much stronger legislation and regulation, just like in past American history when you get a major disaster, whether it's a maritime disaster or a thalidomide drug disaster, there is action in Congress. So why haven't some of the more progressive members of Congress, why haven't people who headed the FDA like David Kessler really gone on a tear here?
Well, Ralph, there was legislation in 2012 after the heparin tragedy and they're just estimates, that 250 people died as a result of it. We really don't know because it's so hard to show cause and effect from a bad drug. But this legislation ramped up inspections in China, and the FDA is in there much more than it used to be. But what that legislation did was basically give a free pass to corporations to do more outsourcing to China because they can say, well, it was made in an FDA-inspected facility. So it actually accelerated outsourcing of production to China.
You know, I just asked Dr. Sid Wolf, head of Public Citizens Health Research Group, are these drugs labeled? I mean, can people go into pharmacies and say, is this made in China? Will the pharmacist know? Will the bottle package have it? Is there a country of origin labeling requirement? And if not, why not?
We found that some manufacturers do say where the drug and the ingredient is made, but that's rare. If you call them up, they may tell you. And I think any good company would be proud of where their products are being made, Ralph, but many do not. There was country of origin labeling legislation put forward about 10 years ago, but it was immediately killed. And when I asked an industry person to describe why that happened, this person said, well, the industry probably thought it wouldn't be good for their customers to know where their medicines are being made. And that's because, according to an old poll from the Pew Trust, only 6% of Americans trust medicines made in China. So companies have good reason to hide it.
Well, I think some listeners would now be asking, why can't the U.S. drug companies make these drugs here? Some of them who are more aware of how we subsidize the drug industry would also add that these U.S. drug companies, like Eli Lilly and Merck, are given huge tax credits for doing research and development, which is you do without tax credits. They're given free R&D results, including clinical trials by the National Institutes of Health and to selected drug companies. That's a big windfall. And there's no reasonable price controls on drugs, unlike all other countries. They can go to the roof, and we've been reading, $100,000 for a medicine per patient per year and so forth. So given all these subsidies, Why are they outsourcing these drugs to China, which obviously is a cost-cutting invitation to them? But don't they have any patriotism? Don't they have any limitations on their greed? And what would you say to listeners who said that?
Well, I would break it up into two groups of companies, Ralph. First, you have the generic manufacturers. And let's face it, 90% of the prescriptions out there are generic drugs. And that generic drug manufacturing is disappearing very quickly in the United States. I said to a generic drug company executive not long ago that China is an existential threat to your business, and there was no pushback whatsoever. And the reason for this is China has an industrial policy to become the pharmacy to the world. And it is ramping up production of generics, not just the active ingredients anymore. Now it's going up the value chain. And we're seeing blood pressure medicines and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's medicines, HIV/AIDS, birth control pills, others that you mentioned in the opening, being made in China. So that's the generic side of the house. And then there's the brand name pharma companies, and they do produce some generics over in China. That's for the U.S. market and also for the Chinese market. And why do they do that? The Chinese government says if you want to do business in China, if you want to access our millions and millions of people who their incomes are increasing, their demands for good medical care are rising, and frankly, the Chinese don't trust domestically made, Chinese-made medicines. They want the Western brands. And so the companies are forced to move manufacturing to China if, in fact, they want to access that lucrative market. The question is, how long is that going to last? I think the real challenge that we're seeing now is that the brand name companies have also moved and spent billions in research and development in China.
Give us some idea of percentages here. What percent of drugs used in this country are imported from China and to a lesser extent India? What percent of the essential ingredients, that's the therapeutic part that's in your medicines, are imported?
It's actually quite complicated. And for those who are outside the industry like us looking in, if you're on the inside, somebody could figure that out. But here's what we do know. The usual figure put out there, which I've heard quoted, is that 80% of our active ingredients come from China and India. That really obfuscates the reality. Even India is dependent on China for the active ingredients. And it's not just that. It's the chemical building blocks needed to make antibiotic ingredients. And China has dominated that market incredibly. The government made huge investments years ago in the infrastructure to make antibiotics. It's messy business. Environmental regulations are non-existent. The waters and the rivers, water tables are polluted in China to no end that we would never permit here, so it's certainly cheaper to do it there. So we've made a huge strategic mistake in this country by giving up antibiotic production. We used to have lots of plants in this country in the 1980s, and we just let it slip through our fingers over to China because China has the will to become a pharmacy to the world. And here in the United States, we have market forces that let companies do what they wish. But I do think that Western companies have met their nemesis, and it's China. China will allow the large pharmaceutical companies to operate there as long as it's good for China.
Well, as you say, it's a perfect place to buy the active therapeutic ingredients to make America's medicines because China has a lot of chemists, cheap labor, virtually non-existent safety and environmental regulations. Those are your words. But you have in Chapter 11, which is called The Perfect Crime, in your book, China RX. We're talking with Rosemary Gibson, author of China RX, and you have a quote in the Chapter 11 which says, in healthcare, we usually operate like a mom and pop shop and don't aggregate information about bad reactions to medicines or investigate for shared causes and commonalities, end quote. In other words, it's very hard to make the cause and effect between contaminated drugs and ingredients and whether someone is getting sicker or dies. And you basically are saying this is a serious national security issue. Well, if it is, where's the Department of Defense? Where's Donald Trump? He's always beating up on China, and he once said about the drug companies during his presidential campaign regarding their high prices that, quote, they're getting away with murder, end quote. Why hasn't he done anything about this?
Well, I don't know how many people in the administration know about this. We're trying to change that. and get the word out. And I appreciate, Ralph, your letter to the president about this burning issue. Even our military is dependent on Chinese products for their medicines simply because that's how commercial trends have gone. So imagine the young men and women in the South China Sea on the naval vessels. Are they dependent on their strategic competitor, their adversary, for their antibiotics? This is an untenable situation. We've had the same issue with military components being made in China almost as sole sources, and good people are trying to change that, but we have to change this for our medicines. And I think putting this out there as a national security issue is a very compelling angle.
Well, as you say in Chapter 14, quote, without firing a missile or hacking the electric grid, China can take America down by disrupting access to essential drugs, end quote. In fact, you quote, one healthcare official is saying that if China suddenly boycotted the export of medicines to the U.S., the hospitals would shut down. So this is, bordering on national security insanity. We're still spending hundreds of billions of dollars, Rosemary, building more nuclear subs, more missiles, more bases all over the world, and we're not spending anything, hardly, to send Food and Drug Administration inspectors to stay in China and investigate and inspect those laboratories. We're not spending anything to inform the American people what's going on. What are you recommending?
Well, let me just add to your point, Ralph. The picture up in southern Connecticut, in New London, you have the nuclear submarines being built, state-of-the-art, best in the world, apparently. And right across the river is the old, what used to be the penicillin fermentation plant in Groton, owned by Pfizer. And so that's no longer. And meanwhile, the men and women who are going to be on that ship somewhere in the world will be dependent on, as mentioned earlier, their foes for their medicines. It's untenable. We recommend several things. First, we have to think of our medicines not as a cheap commodity. We need to think of them as a strategic asset, like we do oil, like we do food commodities, corn and wheat. Food has been used as a weapon of war. And think of the civil unrest that would occur if medicines were not working or if some people could access them but not others. Because remember, the U.S. will have to stand in line behind every other country because as China becomes the global pharmacy to the world becomes dependent on a single country. And no matter what country that is, it's just not a smart thing to do. The second thing we recommend is that somebody needs to own the job of knowing where our medicines come from, what are the risks, do risk assessments, and identify measures to ensure a diversity in manufacturing capability at home and in other countries where we can get them when we need them easily.
Well, there's no tort system to speak of in China, and therefore they don't have fear of liability.
And that's why their drugs are cheaper. That we have a quote in there from someone who expresses the Chinese view is one of the reasons our drugs are so cheap is because we're not liable for them. So that we have a chapter title called Made in China, Sue in America. Good luck.
Well, let's back up here and see what China is doing to protect its own people from these medicines. There's a lot of counterfeit medicines, that's raw criminality, circulating all over the world, sourced in China. And in China, there is a lot of corruption. There is minimal regulation, although in your book you say that the first Chinese head of the Chinese version of the Food and Drug Administration was accused and convicted of taking bribes for approving drugs, which led to at least 10 lives being lost in China, and he was executed. But what is the Chinese government doing just to protect its own people here?
Well, just one comment on the Chinese FDA and the execution of its head. Think about this, Ralph. At that time, that did not deter companies from moving production to China. Think of that. This was the environment. And a Chinese government official came out, period of the execution of that official, and said with admirable candor that we are still at an early stage of development in our capability to do this work. So basically, U.S. companies went ahead and outsourced production of life-saving medicines from a country with the highest standards in the world to a place with virtually no standards. It's absolutely stunning.
Why haven't the Republican-dominated Congress at least had public hearings? I mean, that's good politics, for heaven's sake. They don't have to worry about ideological.
Well, you would think so. There have been tariffs proposed on the chemical components in the first round of proposed tariffs on the chemical components for a number of different pharmaceuticals. When push came to shove and the final list came out, all those tariff lines were removed. And the response of the industry was, well, we're too dependent on China for our medicines. So we have to build up. We need a plan. We don't even have a plan. And that's what we call for in China RX, a strategic plan to ensure we have a safe, reliable access to our medicines when we need them. You know, there was a plant in China that there was an explosion, and they were a primary source of the ingredient to make key antibiotic, and it's now in shortage. So we need a strategic plan that accounts for the risks of our suppliers, and somebody needs to own this. This needs to be somebody's job as part of Homeland Security, Defense Department, with information from FDA.
Let's talk about a really heartrending case that you describe in your book. 45-year-old physician, Dr. Bob Allen. And tell us about what happened.
This is a story of a physician that walked into the hospital in Arizona. He had what appeared to be just a stomach ulcer. He self-diagnosed himself, and he was right. It was bleeding. It was painful. And he was admitted to the hospital, and within 24 hours, he was in multiple organ failure. And this is a case that's pending in litigation, and it's alleged that he was given 2 doses of heparin that were contaminated, but that case is still brewing, so we hope for a just result from that litigation.
Well, apart from the litigation, the evidence in your book is really quite compelling. His wife was a physician. She meticulously documented this. He was given heparin twice within a few hours. There is about as direct a cause-effect as you could imagine.
And that's why this is the only case out of almost 600 that made it through the product liability multi-district litigation to get to a jury trial.
And this happened when?
10 years ago.
Well, this was the one time that the mass media got on to this situation with importing Chinese drugs.
That's because there was a very large body count, and it was news. I wonder if we would have this much exposure today. I just see a lot of tamping down. There's nothing on the valsartan, or very little on the valsartan. What we're seeing in China, did you see how China reacted differently when its vaccines were improperly made? The Chinese government, and those were vaccines for the Chinese market, not for the U.S. market. The Chinese government went in and arrested more than 30 people, and somebody was held accountable. We don't have any accountability for this valsartan issue. None.
Well, apart from corporate drug company greed, the lure of China is lower prices. They can get these ingredients at lower prices. So as long as there's nothing that can counteract the lure of lower costs of production in China, whether they're tariffs, whether they're regulatory standards, whether they're litigation, whether they're straight out prohibition for national security reasons of an essential list of pharmaceuticals that have to be produced in this country, this is going to continue on and on.
When the pain becomes more than the gain, they will leave. Look what happened when Google went in initially and their source code was stolen. This was the heartbeat. And by the way, we have a lot of intellectual property theft in the pharmaceutical industry. But the Chinese government is allowing just enough profitability for these U.S. and other Western companies to have them stay because they need them for now to develop the capability in R&D, operations, and so forth to become the top pharmaceutical developer, researcher, and producer. And then when it doesn't need them anymore, as it did with Google left after 4 years, for the pharma industry, it'll take longer. And that's why we call this, it's a China trap. It lure you in for a period of time, depending upon the industry, and then when you're not needed anymore, you're out. I think American companies have met their nemesis, eventual nemesis. It may be good for a while, but for how long will it go on? It won't go on forever, because eventually China wants to make its medicines for its own people, not to buy American-made drugs.
Just quickly, Rosemary Gibson, author of China RX with Janardhan Prasad Singh. What's Canada doing? Is Canada regulating imports of drugs from China, they have a single payer system, so they can really have a command performance here.
Well, Canada, Europe, and Australia and other countries are in the same boat in terms of dependence on China for medicine. And do we think that Canada has the same kind of capability and resources to go into all those plants in China? It's a very costly proposition for every country to do that. And so what we're seeing now, Ralph, is the mutual recognition of regulatory capability. So the FDA recently signed an agreement with the European Medicines Agency that the FDA will accept as equivalent the European Medicines Agency inspection reports of plants that produce drugs for the United States as well as Europe. The FDA can still go into plants where the Europeans have been in. I think where we're headed on this, and this is not right away, and this really defies all hopes for all the consumer advocates for all those years who fought hard for good consumer protection. I predict that it's just a matter of time before the Chinese FDA says to the U.S. FDA, we want the same thing. We want an equivalency determination that we can inspect plants in China and you accept our inspections. Look, we have a chapter in the book on chicken and how the USDA, Department of Agriculture, determined that the China's inspection system for poultry is equivalent to that of the United States. That means, and China wants to send processed chicken and chicken raised in China to the U.S., and there will be no USDA inspectors in those plants. This is where we're headed. Globalization is de facto deregulation.
Another way of saying we're losing our sovereignty, we're losing our independence to these corporate global juggernauts that have no sense of patriotism, no sense of loyalty to the American people and taxpayers and workers who brought them to these heights of staggering profits.
Yes, and the other thing we're losing control over, that's absolutely right, Ralph. We are also losing control over price. When China gains control over the manufacturing of the finished drugs, do you really think that the Chinese government will care that American consumers can't afford them? And do you think members of Congress will have any leverage to haul in the CEOs of Chinese companies making drugs for the United States and telling them to stop doing that?
That's the fraud in the argument for free trade in medicines, because the argument is, well, these drug companies are going to China, they're getting lower cost ingredients, and they can sell the drug at a more reasonable price back to American consumers. Just the opposite is happening. The prices of drugs have been steadily exceeding in their rise any kind of inflation, and in some areas have been skyrocketing 6, 7, 10 times the price of just a few years ago, as some of the media has pointed out. In 2015, Public Citizen put out a report, Mirror, Mirror on the Wall. Medicare Part D pays needlessly high brand name drug prices compared with other European countries and with U.S. government programs such as the VA and the Pentagon, which are allowed to negotiate volume discounts. So why don't we just, before we turn to Steve and David, you have an appendix, how to find out where your medicines are made. Okay, so listeners are now getting a bit upset listening to this exchange between us and wondering what they can do. They're taking aspirin, they're taking Tylenol, they're taking more serious impact drugs. They're looking at their medicine cabinet, they're walking into the pharmacy. Tell them how they can protect themselves.
Well, the first thing that we can do as consumers, which I've started doing, is calling up to find out where my vitamins are being made, both the ingredients and the finished product. And that changed my decision about where the vitamins that I take. And we should be doing the same with our prescription drugs. Some will tell you, some won't. We do our best to find out. And I would love to see a website where we crowdsource information together on where medicines are coming from. And again, good companies should be proud of where they're making these important products that are life-saving.
Can the local pharmacist tell them anything?
Oh, I doubt it. No, most pharmacists don't know. You'll have to look at the packaging and go in and ask for the box, to see the box, take a picture with your phone, and go home and call the manufacturer, call the distributor, and ask. You can go online. There's a website, druginserts.com. Type in the name of the drug you're taking and look for the label, the packaging, and that may tell you where the product is coming from.
What about the Daily Med website?
That's another resource. It's part of the National Library of Medicine at NIH, and that is a website that has label information. They don't make it easy to find this information, but it's there. Those are the best ways for now to find out.
We're in an election period. There's a few weeks to go for November elections, congressional elections, and state level elections. Our listeners are often known to be active, so if you go to any political rallies and you meet your senator and representative, just tell them, have they read this book, China RX? Are they going to have congressional hearings? Demand that you want to be protected. Look them straight in the eye. This is a kind of demand that really gets right to the core of a politician, because they know that it involves the medicines people are taking, standing in front of them and demanding some sort of action. Steve, do you want to make a comment, or David?
Well, I'm curious. We spend close to $1 trillion on defense. Russia hacked our elections. We're not prepared for that. What happens if we can't get our pharmaceuticals from China? How long would it take to gear up and make our own?
For antibiotics, you don't build a plant overnight. It takes a couple years, and what we're in danger of, and it's a great question, what we're in danger of losing is the know-how to even know how to make complicated products like antibiotics and all their chemical precursors. So we can't ramp up overnight. So it's an enormous risk to this country, both to the civilian, to us, and to military.
The problem, David, is Dr. Janet Woodcock, who has been the resident voice for the pharmaceutical industry inside the FDA for years, and nobody can get her fired because she's got the support of the big drug companies. When she was pressed on this, she basically said, well, we don't want to alarm the people into not taking these medicines. Well, if that's her get up and not go attitude, nothing's going to be done.
It's a national defense issue.
We are so dependent on China that when the FDA went into a plant there, it had gotten reports from companies saying that there were particles in some of the products that they were getting. These were active ingredients and maybe some finished drugs. And some did not have the full therapeutic value. So the FDA banned 29 products from that company. But because we are so dependent on China, the FDA had to exempt 14 of those products from its own ban, including antibiotics and chemotherapy ingredients used to treat childhood cancers. That's how dependent we are. And the same with heparin. We're still at the same level of heparin. One of the recommendations in China RX is there are researchers out there who are coming up with a synthetic heparin. And all that needs is a good look, and if it has merit, investment in the public interest. So we don't have to rely on, in this case, the pig population, which is the source of the active ingredient for this blood thinner heparin, and make it safer in a synthetic process rather than from natural products, which are so variable.
Listeners should know, by the way, that even before China started exporting drugs and ingredients to the U.S., medical journals estimated about 2,000 people a week dying from adverse drug reactions. We're not talking opiates here. We're talking pharmaceutical drugs a week, 100,000 or so a year.
Yeah, Ralph, one point I want to make is really important. We wove together the pieces and found that it was when we opened up free trade with China in 2000, within a couple years, that's when we lost the last penicillin fermentation plant in this country. That's when the last aspirin plant closed. It's when the vitamin C cartel was formed. Chinese companies came in, dumped it on the market at below market price, drove out U.S., European, and Indian producers, and then, talk about cost, once they got control of the market, increased the price 700%.
And the antitrust officials in the Justice Department and Federal Trade Commission are sleeping
Well,
on their watch.
Well, it was only the present administration that supported this case when it went to the Supreme Court. This court was at a jury trial in Brooklyn, then it went to a federal appeals court in Manhattan, which basically legitimized, ready for this, it basically legitimized cartel behavior by China because the Chinese government asserted that by law we require the Chinese companies to form cartels. And the federal judge in New York, a federal appeals court panel, ruled that we can't expect the companies to abide both by U.S. law and Chinese law. So in the interest of international comity, neighborliness, we are going to overturn the jury verdict, which found that with absolute clear evidence of cartel antitrust behavior. Yeah, it was in this administration that they brought it to the Supreme Court and say, no, you can't rely so much on Chinese government assertions, bring it back down to the appeals court.
Well, that one is to be continued, that saga in the courts. But Steve, do you have any comments before we conclude?
I was just going to say this, there are a lot of theories about the fall of the Roman Empire. One of them being that it was the lead in the pots and the pipes. I don't know what the efficacy of that is, but this sounds strangely similar, that these carcinogens that are in our medicines is the thing that could bring us down.
On that note, thank you very much, Rosemary Gibson.
But we are.
I just wanted to end on a high note. Just bring everybody up.
Well, we can't make change until people know what the heck is going on, and I'm so grateful for the show today to let people know, and then we can't fix it until we know.
Well, when your book came out in the spring, did you get on NPR, PBS, any other commercial media?
NPR did a story, The People's Pharmacy, thanks to Joe and Terry Graydon, and we're getting coverage in the Financial Times, NBC, a few other places. It's not a topic. Well, think of it, the major networks, they all have investments in China.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. The easiest letter to a senator or representative you can write is, say you're taking medicines, how can you tell where they're made? I expect an immediate reply, Senator, Representative.
I would make it stronger and say, your antibiotic depends on China.
Well, thank you again, Rosemary. By the way, how can people reach you?
I'm at the Hastings Center in Garrison, New York, and if you go there, there should be contact information there.
Very good. Thank you again.
Thank you.
We have been speaking to healthcare expert Rosemary Gibson. Her book is China RX, Exposing the Risk of America's Dependence on China for Medicine. We will link to that at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to welcome back old friend Ken Reed, Policy Director at League of Fans, the nonprofit organization that advocates on behalf of the fans of sports. And I hope personally we can also have a little time to talk about the Colin Kaepernick Nike ad. He's going to be talking about his new book, The Sports Reformers. But first, let's find out what's going on in the world of corporate crime with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. You are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back in a minute.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, September 7, 2018. I'm Russell Mokhiber. If you purchased Empire Kosher whole chicken or chicken parts between September 2017 and June 2018 and still have it in your freezer, Consumer Reports advises that you throw it away because it may be contaminated with a dangerous strain of salmonella. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention announced that 17 people in 4 states, Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, have been sickened by chicken found to contain a virulent strain of salmonella. 8 people have been hospitalized and 1 has died. All of the victims reported eating chicken in the week before they became ill, and most of them said they ate kosher chicken. Of the 9 people who named a brand of chicken, 7 said they had eaten Empire Kosher chicken that was sold between September 2017 and June 2018. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Now, on a slightly lighter note, we turn to the world of sports with our next guest. David?
Ken Reed is the Sports Policy Director for League of Fans, a sports reform organization founded by Ralph Nader and based in Washington, D.C. He writes position papers, columns, and a blog on the biggest and most important issues in sports today. He is the editor of a new book entitled The Sports Reformers, which is a collection of short interviews with current and former athletes, doctors, lawyers, politicians, consumer watchdogs, former athletic administrators, research scientists, civil rights activists, professors, fans, and parents who are working to enhance the positives and lessen the negatives in sports. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Ken Reed.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Ken, in your new book, you recount a theme that has been constant in all your great work in reviewing the sports world, professional sports, amateur sports, and that is it's infected with this demand of win at any cost, profit at any cost. And that's not just the professional teams in football, basketball, baseball, hockey. It goes into college football, high school, sports, and of course, right down to middle school. So we're at the beginning of more and more people speaking up like you. We have in the front pages today where Nike has enlisted Colin Kaepernick, the former quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, in an ad to illustrate their motto, quote, "Just do it," end quote. And that's an unfurling controversy. But in your book, you have a lot of great people being interviewed, short, cogent interviews who have spoken up all over the country. And that's what I'd really like to run by, some of these great people who you've interviewed. And let's start with one of your great concerns, which is the loss of phys ed programs in more and more high schools and middle schools. What can you tell me about Diana Kuteya?
Well, Diana and Brenda Van Lingen, who's also in the book, a couple other people, we touch on the lack of physical education and the decline of recess even. We're in the middle of a childhood obesity epidemic. Kids are less and less active, not only in schools, but at home with their video games and screen time. My concern is what's happening in schools. And there's some schools out there that are being built now without gyms. Physical education isn't even required in a lot of schools. And it's not only hurting the physical health of our kids, but there's plenty of research shows that behavioral problems go up when physical activity goes down. And also on the positive side of physical activity, the more active kids are cardiovascularly, the better they do on academic tests, because physical education or physical activity specifically actually grows brain cells.
And what are these two women doing about this?
Well, there is an organization called PE for Life that is focused on getting physical education back in schools on a daily basis like it was at one time, and specifically cardiovascular physical activity. So instead of just playing 11v11 flag football games, they cut it down to 4-on-4 or 3-on-3 basketball or 3-on-3 soccer. So everyone's moving for the entire period. They're putting heart rate monitors on kids to make sure they're getting their heart rates up enough to have positive effects. And it's just basically trying to overcome what's happened in this country is with the No Child Left Behind legislation. Schools put more and more focus on classroom time and cut out physical education time, when the opposite, if they want to raise scores on these academic tests, would be to get more physical activity, because the research shows a clear link between physical activity and increased academic performance.
Give us the growth since 1980 of childhood obesity.
This is from my book, How We Can Save Sports, a Game Plan, but it says the Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention report that the percentage of children ages 6 to 11 who are now overweight has increased nearly 300% in the last 25 years.
And of course, this means early diabetes. It means a predisposition to high blood pressure. And these women, Brenda Van Lingen and Diana Kuteya, in your book, titled The Sports Reformers, Working to Make the World of Sports a Better Place, are really quite insistent on changing the situation here. I mean, Diana is quoted in your book as saying that she was assistant coaching position at Mount Holyoke College while she was working on her master's degree. And while she was there, she stopped by the gym one day and watched a sixth grade basketball game. The language, and I'm quoting from her, the language from the coaches and parents had a distinct, aggressive, violent, and warlike tone. There was a lot of focusing on attacking the opponent and very little sportsmanship going on. I walked out of the gym thinking, if this stuff is going on during sixth grade games, we need to find a better way. We have to make changes. That's when I began to research and develop my ideas on coaching peace. And she gives her website, coachingpeace.com. How far along are women like these and other people who are trying to change the practice of win at any cost, profit at any cost ideology in sports?
Well, you mentioned early on that the win at all costs, which I call whack, and wacky philosophy, because it goes all the way down to the youth levels. And what's happening is that in the youth and middle school programs, they're specializing and focusing on elite athletes now, trying to get elite athletic teams rather than creating sports opportunities like we used to call intramural sports, where everyone in the school could participate, playground sports, physical education classes. There's long been this philosophy that sport is good in building character and building bodies, et cetera. But what's happening in reality is we're weeding out most of the kids in these schools that aren't athletic enough to play on these elite travel competitive teams.
Well, you've been a leading critic of the whole cover-up of the concussion problem, which affects high school football players, college, and professional. And more and more disclosures are showing what a devastating epidemic this has been. But why don't we turn to another interview, Dave Zarin. Why don't you tell us about Dave Zarin?
Well, he's a great colleague and inspiration to me. He's been at this longer than I have. He's one of the leading sports journalists, activists in the country, /activists. He writes about the intersection between sports and social, political, cultural issues, and is doing a great job on various issues, from win at all costs and publicly financed stadiums to concussions and youth sports. So he's out there. He's one of our best and loudest voices on these subjects.
And how about this St. John's up in Minnesota football coach who I interviewed once, John Gagliardi? He was a tremendous winning record. What did he do that was so unique?
Well, yeah, first of all, he's the winningest football coach of all time across all levels. And the main thing is, the lesson from John is that he provides proof that you don't have to be an autocratic, authoritarian drill sergeant like Vince Lombardi to be successful in team sports. He was a great humanitarian coach. His only rule was the golden rule. He was way ahead of his time in terms of not having full contact practices during the week to prevent injuries, including concussions. They did a lot of their practices in shorts, and they were hour-and-a-half practices. They ran through plays and conditioned, and that's pretty much what he did. And he won more games than anyone else in football history.
And he let the quarterback call most of the plays, and he graduated his athletes almost 100% rate. He's recently retired. I tried to get him to write his autobiography, but he was too modest. But he's a real legend. And This is a fascinating interview in your book, The Sports Reformers. What about that great writer for the New York Times and the great author, Robert Lipsyte, who has been a great supporter of the League of Fans group in your work?
Yes, I met Robert Lipsyte, who was a longtime New York Times sports columnist, probably 25, 30 years ago at a sports issues conference. And we had a long talk, and he encouraged me to get into this area and helped me get an op-ed published in the New York Times. It kind of kicked off my career. But he's another pioneer in terms of being a sports activist journalist. Back when he was writing in the 70s and 80s, primarily, there was a lot of what he called godding up the athletes and making athletes on a pedestal, making sports events seem like sacramental activities that are of the utmost importance. He did a good job of showing the faults of not only the athletes, but the organizations themselves. And his book, I think it first came out in 1978, called Sports World, An American Dreamland, is a seminal work in sports journalism in terms of focusing on the issues behind the games themselves.
Well, let's go to Terry Lakowski, who's a champion of equal treatment between male and female athletes starting in high school or earlier, the so-called Title IX requirement. And I know you have two daughters who were athletes. And by the way, listeners should know that Ken Reed was a varsity player in 3 sports in high school. He managed teams. He was in the marketing of sports. He's done it all before he basically said, I got to do the kind of work where I can take my conscience to work and expose so many of these terrible infirmities in organized sports, and getting people off their chairs from their role as spectators and participating in intramural sports or even just in their neighborhood. So tell us about Terry Lakowski.
Well, just to add on to that, I was actually in sports marketing thinking, well, as someone who's passionate about sports, I played basketball and baseball in college. My dad was a coach. I said, sports marketing would be a good career, until I had trouble sleeping for a long time because I was working mostly, a lot of the clients with the firm I was with were in the business of selling sub seats and suites for NFL football teams and NBA basketball teams. And it got to the point where I saw that I was contributing more to the problem than the solution. And it wasn't until I came across actually PE for Life and working for them as a client and helping them with their communication, seeing that you can make a difference through sports, that sports is a great way to positively change the world if it's done properly. And that's doing properly, I mean, by taking the whack, the win at all costs, and the pack, profit at all costs out of it, you can really use sports to do some positive things. Now back to Terry Lukowski. She's a former athlete herself who grew tired of feeling like a second-class citizen when it came to the boys and having to practice in the quote-unquote girls' gym and getting hand-me-down uniforms and smaller travel budgets, et cetera. And she went on and did some of her master's work in Title IX and turned it into a career. She's been one of our leaders on equal opportunity in sports, both for gender and for disabled athletes. She's a consultant now and does great work promoting equal access to sports at all levels.
Indeed. She's very articulate on this, and there's been a lot of progress in enforcing Title IX around the country, but it's still a lot more to do.
Ken, I wanted to talk to both you and Ralph about the Colin Kaepernick Nike ad, the print ad that was black and white, Colin Kaepernick's face, and the tagline is "Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything." And what's fascinating to me to talk to both of you about this is that it really does come at the intersection of sports, social activism, and corporate power. Because here you have a corporation, Nike, sort of taking a stand that is not conventional, which they are known to do. And as a result, people are burning their Nike shoes, apparently. And Donald Trump has actually softened his stance when he was asked about it. He didn't talk in terms of Kaepernick necessarily, but he talked in terms of Nike has a right to say and do what they want to do. And then, of course, you find out later, or actually he admits it himself, that Nike is a tenant in one of the Trump organization's buildings. And he literally says they pay a lot of rent. And he admits that. So it's really kind of just a mishmash of interest colliding here. You have a corporation, looks like it might be doing something right by free speech, and then you have this president who seems to soften it because it's a corporation. What, Ken and Ralph, sort it out for me?
Well, I wrote about this yesterday at leagueoffans.org, and one of the things that first struck me was how shocking it was. I mean, Nike not only is a huge corporation, but they are an NFL corporate sponsor that provides the game uniforms for all NFL teams. And as we know, the NFL owners have been totally against Colin Kaepernick to the point where he's filed a collusion lawsuit against them, claiming that they colluded and won't hire him as a quarterback in his prime. And so for Nike to do that with NFL as one of their big sponsors was pretty shocking. Second,
they provide all the uniforms for the NFL.
Yeah, they provide all the uniforms. So I imagine Roger Goodell and Jerry Jones and all the other owners were shocked because Nike said they didn't talk to the NFL before they came out with this campaign, which is interesting in itself as well. So I can imagine the conversations in the boardrooms of NFL teams about this campaign. It's also ironic that Nike is being viewed now by some on the left as a socially progressive corporation because of this campaign, and they have such a long history of being just the opposite in terms of sweatshops, poor pay and labor situations for their products around the world, and just this past year being seen and as a sexist work environment. So
yeah, I can't figure out whose side I'm supposed to be on.
Yeah, it's strange.
Trump is saying something. Oh, wait a minute, but it's that. And then Nike's sounds good, but they still have sweatshops. And, it's crazy.
It is crazy. But, Nike has explored all these issues. They kind of have a history, as Ralph alluded to, of some ads, rebel type ads, way back when Spike Lee and Michael Jordan got involved with Nike. And they also know the research that 40% of all shoppers by 2020 are expected to be millennials. And so I think some of the older white males that are mostly upset with this Kaepernick thing and this ad campaign aren't that big a concern to them as the younger millennials are that they're trying to target here. Kaepernick's jersey has remained one of the top 50 sellers in the NFL these last 2 years, and he hasn't played it down.
Steve, the less Kaepernick talks, the more popular he becomes in the polls. The polls are showing a gradual rise in support for his right to do what he did. And I think that reached the attention of the Nike merchandisers. I would expect that they made a tremendous study about the pro and cons here for their sales.
Right.
This was not an off-the-cuff
They
decision.
gamed this out. Yeah.
Well, and also what I saw is they went back in history and looked at people like Muhammad Ali and others that stood up for civil rights in the 60s and 70s, et cetera, and saw that they ended up on the right side of history and became very popular. And I think they view Kaepernick as someone in 10, 15 years that is going to be looked at a lot more favorably than he currently is by the country as a whole. I mean, this guy, I heard yesterday people complaining about the sacrificed everything part of the campaign because he's going to get compensated pretty well, I imagine, by Nike, which is good for him. He's given up his career in its prime, and he hasn't been paid by the NFL. But he did sacrifice his career and the salaries to do this. I mean, at 30 years old, he was in the prime as a quarterback, and he gave that up. So, whether he sacrificed everything or not, different. But he actually has contributed $1 million or more to some of these social causes. And like Ralph says, he speaks very little, but has been very powerful in terms of a symbol fighting for social justice in this country.
Thank you very much, Ken. We're out of time, but I hope you'll have more interviews around the country with this book. It's an easy read, but it's a very, very probing and a very, very enlightening and motivating read.
Well, thanks for those words, Ralph, and I appreciate the time.
You're welcome.
Well, that's our show. I want to thank our guests today, Rosemary Gibson and Ken Reed. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, we got some pretty good extras coming up in the wrap-up.
Join us next week when we talk to Jeffrey Clements, author of Corporations Are Not People. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. He's a great educator, Jeffrey Clements. And by the way, listeners, the one thing you can do from this program is call your local high school and middle school and ask them about physical education.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Welcome to the wrap-up, where we get to talk a little more to both Rosemary Gibson and Ken Reed. First up, Ralph and Rosemary talk about the dangers of depending on China for meds during a global pandemic.
Well, my letter to President Trump obviously has not been answered, but I did refer to a New York Times report saying that the Chinese government, upset with his imposition of tariffs on Chinese exports to the U.S., has also been withholding for months the transfer to our Centers for Disease Control of laboratory samples on the latest mutating influenza virus, which is very deadly, that has spread in some Chinese rural areas. You think the Chinese are really playing that kind of retaliatory game? I mean, this is extremely serious, because if the Centers for Disease Control doesn't have these specimens, they can't go to work on developing a vaccine ahead of a potential global pandemic that could kill millions of people.
Ralph, there is a history whereby China has withheld information from the United States. Remember the melamine that killed cats and dogs in the United States? Well, when the FDA tried to get into those manufacturing facilities, and it took weeks and weeks, and senators wrote letters to the Chinese ambassador here in Washington. And in some cases, the plants were totally demolished once the FDA inspectors got there. We cite an example in the book of some of your listeners might remember the explosions in the port city Tianjin about a couple of years ago. And you could see these explosions, from satellites. It was so huge. And a couple months later, 2 days before Christmas, the FDA puts out an alert to U.S.-based companies saying, by the way, we found hydrogen cyanide contamination in drug products coming from a company located near that explosion. And they encouraged all of their importing companies to test for 40 different contaminants that were found at the scene of that explosion. So,
does the FDA have a formal agreement with China about sending inspectors over there to inspect Chinese labs?
there's the formal agreement, and then there's what really happens on the ground. Remember that in foreign countries, FDA inspections are announced in advance, 4 to 6 weeks. In the U.S., the FDA can just walk into a manufacturing plant. So you can do a lot of things in 4 to 6 weeks to get ready. So it truly is an unlevel playing field. And there's censorship of information. China battens down the hatches when it's bad news about something that is adverse to their reputation. And so this has been going on for a long time, where China withholds important information to countries in the world. Look at this blood pressure medicine. Have we heard a peep from this Chinese manufacturer? Nothing. Heard nothing.
Now, Steve apologizes for bringing the show down.
Thank you, Rosemary. That was great. I'm sorry for my fall of the Roman Empire comment. I kind of took a story that was very scary and then just put a real dark shade on it.
Well, I understand, Steve, but I feel I got to get up in the morning and try to do something, right?
Yeah. No, that's that.
Yeah.
And here's my theory about all of that, because I talk to people about these kinds of issues all the time since I've been doing the radio show, and a lot of people just don't want to deal with things because they say that it makes them anxious, or that I'll just get too depressed, especially in the era of Trump. And for me, I feel the opposite. And I know, this is endemic to Ralph's point of view, is that knowledge is actually a power, as the cliche goes. And that the more I know, I guess the clearer the vision of the landscape, the more I can kind of, I get less depressed. And because you know what needs to be done about it too.
Right. And I have to hope, Steve, that there are rational people out there who, once they know, will understand this is insane, especially for the military. And
well, like David suggested and Ralph suggested, this is a national security issue, and we always have will when it has to do with national security.
Right.
And if there's money to be made.
Right, and there's money to be made. Can I tell you something that's, to me, slightly hopeful? This is a fascinating way how capitalism works. There's now more than 100 hospitals, and this is going to come out tomorrow. I think it's an interesting story. 100 hospitals have agreed to put up capital, including the VA, to invest in drug manufacturing directly that bypasses all the middlemen in these group purchasing organizations. And the reason they're putting up the money is because every day they spend hours and hours, who knows how much money over these years, dealing with drug shortages, some basic stuff. And those shortages occur for a whole bunch of different reasons. And certainly one of them that contributes to this is our dependence on China and the centralization of the global supply chain. So these guys are putting up lots of money, and it's in their interest, financial interest, to do it.
Yeah.
And I like how they're bypassing, the rest of the system.
Well, I know when I called my doctor about the valsartan, or actually called the pharmacy, Express Scripts, they said, yeah, can't, because I did have bottles of it from other companies that apparently were not infected by this. I don't know if they came from China or not either, but they weren't on the list. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, actually, we have a valsartan shortage, so your doctor's going to have to put you on a substitute. And fortunately for me, I guess the substitute is fine, but that's probably not the case for a lot of other medicines.
So do you get your medicine, valsartan, by mail? Is that how you were getting, or did you go into you did?
Yeah.
Rosemary, you should send more letters to officials in high places, like the Secretary of Defense and so forth.
Yeah, I think there's opportunity to get some language in an executive order.
Yeah.
To do and that's, to be honest, I was working on that right before you called. I think
and try to tell the White House press corps about this, and try to call some White House aide, because you got a president who's been, unlike other presidents, has been beating up on China. So this is just a natural step. That would blow the issue wide open to the media.
Well, there was an executive order I was just looking at on rare earths. How do we, cut out that 95% reliance on China, which if we don't get rare earths, I mean, that's huge. The medicines is far more persuasive. So I'm just actually taking a look at that. And there are good channels we can get to get this in front of the National Trade Council people. that's the right home for it. Yeah.
By the way, just a last comment. Have you ever contacted the U.S.-China Economic Commission in Washington?
Oh, sure. We have a quote from Dan Slane on that commission and Mike Wessel with the steel workers, and they were actually very supportive. I mean, we talked to a guy who did a study on military components dependent on China. Anybody else? You think could Bernie Sanders? Who would do hearings on this, Ralph?
Well, no one's going to do hearings if the Democrats don't take over. I mean, we don't even have a McCain-type maverick I can think of. But what I would do is I would call Jamie Raskin, Congressman Jamie, and get his view of it.
Jamie Raskin.
Raskin. Yeah, he's the most progressive member of Congress in Maryland.
And now, Ralph talks to Ken Reed about more sports reformers.
What about the lawyer Cyrus Mehri and his criticism of the NFL football scene?
Well, Cyrus, he's been involved advocating for NFL players' rights for a long time, and also for minority coaches. He was the driving force between what's called the Rooney Rule in terms of making sure NFL teams give equal opportunity interviews for coaches from minority backgrounds. So that's how he first got involved in the NFL. Recently, he discovered that the NFL players have the worst of all things. They have the shortest careers, they get the least pay, they have the most health and safety risks, and they have the worst union representation. Their NFL union is very weak. And so he thought he was going to make a run for executive director of the NFLPA, the National Football League's Players Association, and he started a campaign. Several former players who are in the Hall of Fame encouraged him to do so because they thought the current union leader, DeMaurice Smith, wasn't doing a good job at all. So Cyrus Mehri looked into it, started a campaign, and it got shot down before it even had a chance to finish because the NFLPA has a 14-member committee that for some reason has the rights to pick and choose if there's going to be an election for their executive director or not. And they just voted unanimously to keep the DeMaurice Smith going without even presenting Cyrus Mehri to the players across the league or even all 32 player reps. So Cyrus Mehri's attempt was shot down at this point, but he's going to keep working to get better representation to the NFL players. One of the things he brought up about DeMaurice Smith, the current NFLPA head, is that he comes from a corporate law background, has no workers' rights background, and he's just flabbergasted on why the players would have someone like him leading their cause.
One thing I've said over the years, Ken Reed, we're talking with Ken Reed, the author of the new book, The Sports Reformers, is that there's a lot of responsibility put on the back of the sports pages in newspapers and magazines and on TV and ESPN. They're just infatuated with, the whole scene of win at any cost, profit at any cost, always talking about contracts, always, putting in-play ads where you can't even relish somebody who's hitting a home run, say for the Yankees, because they say, well, this is supported by Kia Automobile Company. And you've really been taking out against this. And what I like about your work is you start with everyday people who just need more physical activity. As we move more and more into virtual reality, looking at screens on our phones and computers and TV, and with the advent of virtual reality goggles only a few years away, sports is the only real mass interaction with each other, whether formally, organized, unorganized, in the neighborhoods. And tell us about the importance you attribute to that and how people can get things going. I mean, suppose somebody listening to this program is in a neighborhood. It's not a bad neighborhood. It doesn't know many of the neighbors. How can he use sports to connect the neighborhoods? And who knows what will happen when people get connected on other civic issues?
Well, yeah, I think one of the purposes for this book is to inspire people who love sports but see a lot of flaws and to get them involved in making sports better. These interviews, as was mentioned at the beginning of my segment, run the gamut from Tom McMillan, who's a former congressman, an NBA player and Rhodes Scholar, and famous sports writers like Frank DeFord and Robert Lipsyte, all the way down to parents who just saw problems at their local Little League and wanted to get involved and started up a nonprofit, et cetera. So a big idea was to show people that see sports as something of great worth, as something that connects people and makes them healthier physically, socially, mentally, and then wanted to get involved, but just don't know how. It's a bottom-up effort. One of the things that I think is important is to change sports is going to happen from the grassroots, because at the professional level, they're making too much money with the way the system is now, and it's unregulated sports cartels in this country. We don't have things like other countries do, like a sports minister or any sports regulation at all. It's basically whatever the pro leagues want to do, and that professionalization goes all the way down to college, high school, and youth sports. So we got to work at this from the bottom up, and that means that local communities getting involved in your little leagues in terms of equal access and for disabled athletes or females. I mean, I talked to someone the other day who called me looking for advice on Title IX not being adhered to in the little farming community here in Colorado. The girls were having to practice early in the morning. They had to practice in what they still call the girls' gym, if you believe that. Their uniforms were terrible shape. And so we gave him enough information where he could get going to the school board and the administrators and get some changes made. So you don't have to change what's going on nationally in Washington, D.C. if you want to impact sports. You can do it at your local community in many ways. Just get involved and get loud, as Dave Zirin would say.
Get loud. I like that because, I think the most censorious press in America today is the sports press. I mean, they talk elaborately, flamboyantly, endlessly, tactics, strategy. You'd think they were mavericks, but they're censoring themselves like crazy. And there's no better example of that than the great work you've done, Ken. And while you get interviews here and there in Chicago and so forth on radio, you have not been allowed in the mass sports audiences the way you should be. And so I, for example, have asked the program on NPR, which I think is on Saturday morning, called Only a Game. And I wrote the interviewer a few months ago, and I said, I like the title of your program, 1 hour long, Only a Game. It's quite entertaining. Some of it is quite thoughtful. But it's more than only a game. There are tens of thousands of people in this country who have been subjected to concussions. There is greed. There's exploitation. There's cruelty, there's marginalization, and didn't get an answer.
Well, Ralph, I think one of the big problems with sports media, which has long been called the toy department of journalism, and there's a lot of truth to that, but they approach sports like it's an entertainment thing, and that people are only interested in sports as an escape from real world issues, and hence they don't want to dive into real world issues. Some of the best sports journalism we've had have been by people like Taylor Branch, the great civil rights writer who is interviewed in this book as well, or Joe Nocera, who's a longtime columnist for various publications. But they're outside of the sports world, and they came in and looked at what's going on with NCAA athletes and how they're not getting paid and getting abused in multiple ways. And they wrote great pieces that should have been done by sports journalists. But sports journalists avoid it. They're a lot of times partners with the sports organizations themselves, like ESPN. It's hard to be a true journalistic entity when they basically put on a lot of the events that they're supposedly covering. So it's taken people from outside the sports journalism field to make a dent into some of these problems. I was talking to Frank DeFord, and he mentions in the book that the United States is the only place in the world right now where elite athletes that are in sports that are making money are still forced to be amateurs. And that's college basketball and college football players.
Certainly in Division I, NCAA. Yeah,
NCAA
right.
Division I, yeah. It's the only place where athletes are forced to be amateurs, where there's big money available and everyone's making money. Coaches are making $7 million a year. Athletic directors are making big money. DeFord said even journalists like himself are making big money. And meanwhile, the athletes putting on the product are getting nothing. I mean, a scholarship isn't nothing. I don't want to put it that way, but it's well below what their value is for what they present to the...
And they're not getting much of an education either.
No, it becomes a job, and it's a job that's not compensated very well. They're putting 50 plus hours a week into their sport. It's hard to imagine how you could even be a student and do the homework and stuff you need to get a real degree. the ones that do it should be greatly admired. If you can get a true degree while playing big-time sports, more power to you.
Well, we have 600 or so cable channels, last I counted. Most of it unbelievable junk entertainment. And we don't have a single cable channel to discuss the serious and wonderful ways of sports that's covered in your book and other critical writers that are interviewed in your book. One thing our listeners can do is they can call their local middle school and high school and say, what's the situation with phys ed? Do you have physical education? Have you dropped it? Have you curtailed it? Do you know the studies that show that it reduces obesity, it improves the health of the students, and it improves their academic performance? I mean, listeners, you can do that. And there aren't many arguments against it other than the formidable, ghastly computer that they want to replace and the STEM-type concentration on the physical sciences, while the bodies and health of these students have been over time deteriorating. How do people get your book, The Sports Reformers Working to Make the World of Sports a Better Place? Just out, and I was privileged to write a foreword to this book.
Yes, and I appreciate that, Ralph. Right now, the book's only available at Amazon.com. You can look for this book and my 4 other books by going to Amazon.com/author/Dr. Ken Reed, DrKenReed, Amazon.com/author/Dr. Ken Reed. And my other books, How We Can Save Sports, A Game Plan, Ego versus Soul in Sports, Sports Reformers. And also I have a book called Game Changer about someone who was a PE teacher in the traditional sense of just being an old coach who was teaching PE so he could coach, and then decided to make his whole career about getting more kids active and cardiovascular physical education. It's an inspirational read.
Is it available on barnesandnoble.com or Powell's out of Portland, Oregon, just to avoid the dreaded Amazon Goliath?
Yeah, I agree. Right now, the other books are available on those outlets. The new one, The Sports Reformers, hasn't been picked up yet by Barnes & Noble or Powell's.
Well, it's a great book because it has so many voices, authentic voices, great people trying to make sports a better part of our culture, and there's such huge improvements possible, and there are a lot of things going on that you don't read about or hear about or see on the sports media, as Ken has pointed out.
And that's a wrap. Join us again next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we talk to attorney Jeffrey Clements about his book, Corporations Are Not People.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.